Minecraft, the heart of the overworld, an original and cozy story for all ages. Chapter 1. Glitch in the Grasslands. Steve opened his eyes. The world shimmered into focus, blocky hills, scattered oak trees, and a peaceful plains biome under the bright square sun. He took a breath of the cool, coated air and looked around. No tools, no armor, no items, just an empty inventory and the familiar feeling of starting fresh. He checked the sky. The sun was already moving. Time to act fast. With practiced hands, Steve punched a nearby oak tree. The thump of his fists against bark echoed in the air. Within seconds, he had gathered enough logs to craft planks and build a crafting table. Then came sticks, a wooden pickaxe, and a wooden sword, his first tools. Back to basics, Steve said with a small grin. He spotted a hill nearby and began digging a quick shelter into the dirt side with his pickaxe. A humble hidey hole, just enough space for himself, the crafting table, and maybe a furnace later. He placed a wooden door, stepped inside, and sealed it shut. Outside, the sound of mobs beginning to spawn echoed in the night. Groaning zombies, hissing spiders, and the distant rattle of a skeleton's bowstring. Steve sat quietly in his shelter, planning his next moves. That's when he noticed it. A strange light. It flickered in the corner of his hideout, soft, purple, and pulsing like a heartbeat. Steve turned slowly. There, embedded in the dirt wall, was a thin crack. Not a normal block. Not any block he'd ever seen. Purple particles drifted out of it like those from a nether portal, but something was off. He stepped closer. Suddenly, a message appeared before his eyes, burning across the air like a system prompt. System alert. World instability detected. Corruption spreading. Locate the heart of the overworld. Steve blinked. What? The crack glowed brighter for a moment, then vanished completely, leaving behind a single dropped item spinning on the ground. A book and quill. Steve picked it up. The item glowed faintly, like an enchanted tool. He opened it. To the player who reads this, the overworld is breaking. The code that holds our world together is unraveling, bit by bit, biome by biome. I tried to stop it, but I failed. Now it's up to you. Deep below the bedrock, beyond even the end and the nether, lies the heart of the overworld. If it is not restored soon, everything will glitch into chaos. Find the fragments. Rebuild the heart. You are our last hope. Nia the Builder. Steve's hand dropped to his side, the book still open. The heart of the overworld? He'd explored countless worlds, fought ender dragons, conquered ocean monuments, but he'd never heard of this. A soft spark flickered again in the dirt where the crack had been, but it was gone in an instant. Steve looked up at the ceiling of his tiny shelter. Somewhere, out there in the dark plains beyond, was a mystery bigger than any stronghold or ancient city. He opened his inventory, placed the book and quill in the top left slot, and gripped his wooden sword tightly. Outside, the mobs groaned louder, but Steve had already made up his mind. The overworld needed him, and he was ready. Chapter 2. The First Fragment. Steve stepped out of his shelter at sunrise. The blocky light spilled across the plains, casting long shadows from the trees and lighting the tops of the tall grass in gold. Most of the mobs from the night had already burned away, leaving behind a few bones and rotten flesh scattered across the field. He scanned the horizon, hand resting on his wooden sword. The world looked normal, peaceful even, but the book still sat in his hotbar, a glowing reminder that something deeper, stranger, was happening beneath the surface. Steve headed toward a nearby hill to get a better view. From the top, he spotted the landmarks of a typical world, a winding river, a patch of dark oak forest to the west, and just beyond that, barely visible, a flicker of something unusual. A shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising off a desert. That's where he went. As he crossed into the dark oak forest, the canopy closed overhead. Shadows danced between the trunks, and the sound of mobs still lurking in the shade kept Steve on alert. He gathered mushrooms along the way, both red and brown, and crafted a couple of mushroom stews when he had a moment. Food was important. This journey wouldn't be short. The shimmer grew clearer as he neared a clearing in the forest. Steve parted the last few leaves and froze. In the middle of a mossy stone circle sat a ruined portal. Obsidian blocks glowed faintly, laced with crimson nether vines. Half buried in the grass was a broken chest, and scattered around it were items, some familiar, some not. Steve crouched and examined the pile. There was a piece of flint and steel, worn down to its final use, a golden shovel with only a sliver of durability, and something else, an odd, swirling shard that shimmered with both ender purple and the orange glow of magma. You have found fragment number 1, Seed of Origin. The message flashed across his view as Steve picked it up. The shard pulsed gently in his hand, like a heartbeat. He opened the book again. A new page had appeared. Fragment 1, the Seed of Origin. All worlds begin with a seed. This one was no different. When corrupted, the first seed splits, leaking its power across biomes. Find them, unite them, restore the heart. Steve placed the shard in the safest slot of his inventory. As he looked up, the ruined portal sparked unexpectedly. A puff of purple smoke burst from one of the obsidian blocks, and something stepped out. It wasn't a piglin. It wasn't even a normal mob. Its body flickered and glitched, shifting between a zombie's shape and a villager's, then a skeleton's, then something unrecognizable. Its eyes glowed bright red, and its movements were jerky, like broken frames in a corrupted animation. "Not good," Steve muttered. The glitched mob let out a garbled screech and lunged forward. Steve dodged, swinging his wooden sword. The hit connected, but the creature didn't flinch. It shuddered, reassembled itself, and came back stronger. Bits of code shimmered around its edges, as if reality itself couldn't hold it stable. Steve ran. Through the forest, between thick trees and under low branches, the creature gave chase. It moved fast, unnatural, sometimes blinking forward in strange bursts. Steve ducked behind a rock, reached into his inventory, and threw down a handful of cobblestone blocks, building a quick wall. Then he heard it again. Bzz, zap! The creature glitched through the wall. Steve had seconds. He opened the crafting table and combined sticks and cobble. Just in time, a stone sword. This time, when the creature charged, Steve met it head-on. The stone blade connected with a flash of light. The creature screamed in static, stumbling backward. Steve struck again and again, and on the final hit, it burst apart into a swirl of red pixels and flickering sparks. Silence returned to the forest. Steve panted, heart pounding. He checked his health, 3 hearts left. He quickly ate some mushroom stew and watched his hearts tick back up. Then he noticed something on the ground. A glitched eye, not quite an ender eye, but not far off. He picked it up, and the book updated again. Glitched eye acquired. These will guide you. Each points toward the next fragment, though beware, the path will twist. Steve looked to the horizon. He now had a piece of the puzzle. One fragment of a broken world. He still didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. This world was unraveling, and only he could put it back together. He checked the sun. Still early afternoon, enough time to travel before the next nightfall. With his stone sword in hand and the Seed of Origin tucked safely away, Steve headed out once again, toward the next mystery, toward the next fragment, toward the heart of the Overworld. Chapter 3: Signals in the Sand. Steve followed the glitched eye for hours. It floated in his hand like an ender eye, pulsing with an erratic glow. Each time he activated it, the eye spun, shook, and pointed south, toward the horizon, beyond forests and rivers. He passed through a flower forest, stopping only to collect a few poppies and azures. The glitched eye pulsed harder when he reached the edge of the savanna, then again when he descended into the cool sands of a desert biome. That's where things got weird. It started with the sky. The square sun had been directly overhead when he entered the desert, but after a few minutes of walking, it hadn't moved. The lighting was stuck in a strange golden haze. No shadows shifted, no mobs spawned. Even the sand beneath Steve's boots had an odd shimmer, like it was flickering between textures. Then he saw it, half buried in the dunes, an old desert temple. Except, not normal. One of its towers was floating, slightly off the ground. The top rotated slowly, like a glitched chunk out of sync with the rest of the structure. The sandstone blocks flickered between smooth and cut versions, changing every few seconds. It was as if the code holding it together was struggling to load. Steve approached with caution. The glitched eye pulsed wildly in his hotbar. Inside, the central chamber looked familiar. 4 smooth sandstone pillars, a blue terracotta tile in the center, and a long drop into the treasure room below. But instead of jumping in, Steve crouched and carefully mined the orange tile next to the pressure plate, disabling the TNT trap below. He dropped down. 4 chests sat waiting. The first held bones, some sand, and a single iron ingot. The second, a golden apple and 3 emeralds. The third contained a fragment. It shimmered in Steve's hand. This one shaped like a warped prism, green and gold, with shifting patterns along its surface. You have found Fragment 2, Pulse of the Dunes. Another page appeared in the book and quill. Fragment 2, Pulse of the Dunes. Even time forgets. The desert once whispered with knowledge, but now it stutters. Glitches echo through lost ruins. This fragment holds rhythm of time, memory, and the old pulse of sand. But before Steve could open the 4th chest, the temple rumbled. The blocks began to shift around him, tiles jumping between types, columns splitting and snapping back in place. The floor twisted upward, and with a burst of static, a corrupted version of the desert husk burst from the far wall. It had no face, just a flickering void where eyes should be. And it wasn't alone. A second one emerged from the sandstone, then a third. Their bodies jittered as they moved, sand particles falling from them like smoke. They let out eerie, broken growls and charged. Steve didn't hesitate. He downed the golden apple, then swapped to his stone sword. The first hit staggered one of the husks, but it didn't fall. He backed up, dodged left, and struck again. 2 quick hits and it shattered, exploding into sand and static. The others came faster. Steve jumped onto a sandstone ledge, struck from above, and took down the second. The third grabbed his leg, its touch freezing his movement for a second, but he slashed free and brought it down with a final blow. Silence. The dust settled. Steve checked his health, just 4 hearts left. He ate a cooked pork chop from his stash and slowly opened the 4th chest. Inside, a map, but not like normal maps. This one was blank, except for a glowing X marked in the upper corner. Next to the X were strange symbols that shifted like Enderman runes. In the bottom right, one word flickered faintly: Mesa. Steve knew what that meant. The next fragment was hidden in a mesa biome, far from here, likely across an ocean or through treacherous terrain. He added the map to his inventory, climbed out of the collapsing temple, and stood once more beneath the glitching sun. Except the sun had moved. It now hung lower in the sky, as if it had jumped ahead. Steve realized something then. Time itself was broken in this world. Biomes didn't just change visually. The rules inside them were glitching, some faster, some slower. He would have to move carefully, plan smarter, and prepare for worse. He turned west, toward the mesa marked on the map, and began his journey once more. 2 fragments down. Who knew how many to go? But Steve was no ordinary player. He was the one chosen to fix the overworld, and he wouldn't stop until it was whole again. Chapter 4: The Red Canyon Vault. Steve traveled for days. He crossed savannas, rivers, and even a jungle temple half sunken in vines. Along the way, he upgraded his gear, crafting iron tools, a bucket, and even snagging a bow from a lucky skeleton drop. His inventory was fuller now, stocked with cooked food, arrows, and both fragments glowing softly in the hotbar. Eventually, the terrain changed. The green grass gave way to warm red sand. Layered clay cliffs towered ahead, striped in orange, white, and terracotta red. Steve had made it, the mesa biome. As he stepped into the canyon, the air felt still. There was no music, no mobs, just the sound of gravel crunching beneath his boots. He pulled out the fragment map. The glowing X floated above a cliff to the west. Steve climbed the layers carefully, pickaxe in hand. As he neared the marked spot, a gust of wind blew past, then a voice. "Stop right there." Steve froze. From behind a ridge, a figure stepped out. It wasn't a mob, it was a player. She wore dark leather armor patched with copper. Her skin was sun-touched, and her name tag glitched in and out, Naya the Builder. Steve's eyes widened. "The author of the book. You're real?" he asked. She tilted her head. "You got the book and quill. That means the overworld chose you." Steve held out the glowing fragments. Nia's expression shifted, part relief, part fear. "You're further than anyone's made it," she said, "but you don't understand what's coming." She beckoned him to follow. They descended into the canyon, weaving between jagged clay peaks until they reached a wall of smooth red sandstone. Nia placed her hand on the rock. A hidden piston door rumbled open, revealing a vault carved into the mountain. Inside, red stone lamps flickered to life. It was a forgotten lab. Tables lined with crafting components, old armor stands, and maps of the overworld dotted the room. In the center sat a glass display case containing a third fragment, this one blue, shaped like a shard of frozen water. Naya walked up to it. "This is the Frost Spark," she said. "I found it years ago. I tried to rebuild the heart myself, but it was too dangerous alone. The more fragments I collected, the more unstable the world became." Steve glanced at the case. "Then why keep going?" Nia looked him in the eyes. "Because if we don't, this whole world will fall apart. Every biome, every build, every player." Suddenly, the room shook. Blocks above trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling. Naya cursed under her breath. "They followed you." From the entrance, a glowing crack tore open, like the one in Steve's first shelter. A new mob stepped through. This one looked like a pillager, but its crossbow was fused with redstone, and its movements jittered between fast and slow. Behind it came others, corrupted Vex, flickering and screeching, their wings sparking like broken command blocks. Steve and Nia fought side by side. She wielded a custom sword, part diamond, part amethyst, and slashed with precision. Steve took the left flank, shooting down 2 Vex midair and blocking the pillager's glitch bolt with his shield. Sparks flew as they battled, but finally, the last mob burst into particles. The crack sealed shut. Silence returned. Nia staggered to the wall. "They're not just hunting the fragments anymore," she said. "They're hunting you." Steve approached the Frost Spark. As he lifted the case, the book in his inventory flipped to a new page. Fragment 3, Frost Spark. Even fire forgets what it once froze. The spark remembers. Blue fire, ice, and code fused in one. A key to restoring balance, but also a beacon to those who seek to corrupt it. Steve placed the shard next to the others. 3 now, each glowing stronger than before. Naya sat beside a redstone map on the wall. "There's a pattern," she said, tracing her finger across dots on the overworld. "The fragments are appearing in corrupted structures, strongholds, monuments, outposts. The next is likely deep below." Steve looked at her. "Deep like mine shaft? Cave?" She shook her head. "Deep dark," she said. "Warden territory." Steve felt his stomach tighten. He had faced Endermen. He had fought Wither bosses. But the deep dark was different. It was silence. Darkness. One wrong step and the warden would rise. He gripped his sword. "I'll go," he said. Nia handed him a bundle of wool, a spyglass, and a warning. "Don't run. Don't jump. And never ever open a chest without listening first." Steve nodded. He stepped out of the vault, now carrying 3 fragments and a mission that stretched far deeper than he had imagined. Next stop, the deep dark. Chapter 5, Silence Below. Steve descended with care. The entrance to the deep dark was hidden beneath a windswept mountain, marked only by a narrow shaft filled with dripstone and shadow. Naya had given him directions. Follow the cave until the torches stop, then use wool. He lit the first stretch with his own torches, placing them every few blocks as he went deeper. Bats flitted past, and somewhere far off, a skeleton rattled. But as he dropped lower, below even the lush caves, the air changed. Cold, still, even the background music stopped. He reached the final ledge and looked down. A vast cavern stretched below him, shrouded in blackness. Faint blue veins pulsed across the stone. Skulk. He crouched and pulled out the wool blocks from his bundle. Softly, block by block, he descended. The deep dark was breathtaking. Towering ancient city ruins sprawled ahead, half sunk into the stone. Broken halls, cracked deep slate pillars, redstone contraptions once used by builders long gone, and all of it blanketed in skulk that shimmered like moonlight. Steve landed silently and placed a wool block. Step. Another block. Step. He crept forward, watching the skulk sensors twitch with each vibration. A bat flew overhead. Ping. The sensor flashed. Steve dropped to the ground instantly, not breathing. Nothing. Then again, a rustle from the shadows. Not a skeleton. Not a zombie. A low rumble vibrated through the stone. Boom. Boom. The warden was near. Steve didn't move. His heart thudded in his ears. The sound didn't come from footsteps. It came from the ground itself, as if the entire world was reacting to the warden's presence. He waited. Eventually, the vibration faded. He pressed on, sneaking around a ruined archway. The fragment map Nia had marked pulsed slightly, guiding him toward the heart of the city. He passed cracked, chiseled deep slate walls and ancient soul lanterns still glowing faintly. At the center was a chamber he hadn't expected. A redstone laboratory. ancient and mostly intact. Inside were levers, notes, item frames, and at the very back, a display case glowing faintly blue. The fourth fragment. It looked different from the others, like a frozen echo. The shard hovered in place, surrounded by silent particles, pulsing in sync with the skulk beneath it. Steve placed a wool block, stepped forward, and click. A hidden skulk sensor had been placed behind the display. Steve's stomach dropped. Ping, boom, boom. The warden had arrived. It burst through the stone like a force of nature, sniffing, gurgling, twitching toward the sound. Steve froze in place. The warden passed just 10 blocks away, its heartbeat-like chest echoing across the cavern. One wrong move, and he was done. He reached into his inventory, grabbed a snowball, and tossed it far to the left. The warden turned, moved, roared. Boom! The world seemed to shake as it followed the sound. Steve seized the moment, grabbed the fragment, tucked it into his hotbar, and crept backwards, placing wool block after wool block in reverse. The warden roared again, closer, no time. Steve sprinted, sensors lit up, shriekers screamed. Boom, boom, boom. The warden was behind him, fast. Steve leapt onto a wool pad, spun around, and threw down a swift sneak potion Naya had given him. His movement turned near silent. He ducked through a ruined hallway, darted behind a pillar, and finally reached the rope ladder he had crafted earlier. Up, up, up. The warden didn't follow. As the sound faded and the light from the surface peeked through the stone above, Steve collapsed at the top, heart pounding. He'd done it. The book flipped to a new page. Chapter 6, The Cry of Ice. Steve crossed the taiga, moving fast. Snow fell in soft flakes, blanketing the spruce trees and silencing his footsteps. Behind him, the sky flickered in broken frames. Clouds stuttered. A tree vanished, then blinked back in, this time rotated 90 degrees. The world was losing cohesion. He had to move. The fragment map pointed northeast, where the tundra turned to icy cliffs. Soon, Steve stood at the edge of the ice spikes biome, its towering blue crystals piercing the sky like frozen teeth. Wind howled between the columns. His breath fogged the air. Naya had called this place the Cry. Now he understood why. Steve bundled in a spare leather tunic he dyed blue, added Frostwalker boots, and stepped onto the ice. Everything was silent. No mobs, no footsteps, not even ambient cave sounds, just the whistle of wind and the creak of ancient ice shifting under pressure. He followed the map across the frozen terrain until he spotted it, an old Illager outpost buried halfway in snow. Its upper levels still stood tall, flying a tattered black banner with red stitching, one Steve didn't recognize. As he approached, he crouched behind a packed ice ridge. Through a spyglass, he saw the guards. Illagers, but not normal ones. Their skin was slightly blue, as if frostbitten. Their eyes glowed faintly red, and their weapons, axes, crossbows, were laced with frozen skulk. Steve didn't wait for them to notice him. He circled around the back, breaking through the snow-covered wall quietly with a silk-touch shovel. Inside, the structure was eerie, walls layered with icy vines, floors cracked and crumbling. He made his way to the top level, ducking past a patrolling frost pillager. At the top, a strange altar stood. It pulsed with icy light. In its center, floating above a block of blue ice, hovered the fifth fragment, shaped like a snowflake fractured in the middle. Frost spiraled around it like tiny particles suspended in midair. Steve reached for it, but as his fingers touched the fragment, a deep boom rang out. The banner below lit up, and the guards roared in unison. The outpost had been rigged. Suddenly, corrupted Illagers burst from the snow below, vindicators in fur-lined armor, evokers casting frozen fangs of ice across the floor. One of them screamed a single word, over and over, glitching as it spoke. CC code, breach! Steve grabbed the fragment and ran. Down the stairs, across the broken floor, arrows and frost bolts flying past his head. He jumped from the second level, rolled across powdered snow, and made a break for the spikes. Behind him, the evokers summoned a swirling vortex of frozen Vex, their wings trailing ice as they gave chase. Steve pulled out fire charges he'd looted earlier and lobbed them behind him. Boom! Ice cracked. Fire and frost collided, blinding his pursuers for a second. He dove behind an ice spike, caught his breath, and used a book of fire protection on his armor just in case. Then he opened the book and quill. Fragment 5. Cry of Ice. Silence has memory. Frozen time, frozen will. The cry is not just a biome, it is a fracture. This piece remembers the cold logic of the system. It is pure, still unbroken, for now. Steve tucked the fragment into his inventory. 5 now, just 3 more to go. He turned to flee, but froze mid-step. Hovering above the altar he had just looted was a new rift, larger than before, jagged and pulsing with violet static. And from it emerged a figure. Humanoid, armored in obsidian, a cape made of swirling command lines trailing behind him. His name tag flickered red and white, unreadable, but Steve felt the weight of it in his bones. "You gather pieces, but you do not understand the heart," the figure said, voice echoing like a server message. "The code must evolve." Before Steve could react, the figure vanished into static. The rift sealed, and the sky above began to snow sideways. Steve stood there a moment, staring into the place where the figure had vanished. Someone, or something, was guiding the corruption. Not random glitches, not just unstable code, a force, and now it knew about him. He looked at his map. The next fragment lay far to the west, hidden in the depths of a jungle, an overgrown ruin marked with vines and ancient writing. Steve set his compass, adjusted his armor, and stepped back onto the ice, leaving only fading footprints behind him. Chapter 7: Secrets in the Vines. The jungle was thick. Vines hung from the trees, swaying like curtains in a windless room. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Every step Steve took sank a little deeper into the rich green underbrush. It was a sharp contrast to the cold ice he had just left behind, and the air felt suffocating after the open spaces of the tundra. But he wasn't here for the view. The fragment map had pointed him here, to the heart of the jungle. The jungle was known for its labyrinthine paths, hidden temples, and dangerous mobs. Yet none of that fazed Steve as much as the sense that something bigger was at play. The jungle felt like it was watching him. The trees were unnaturally silent, no birds, no creatures, just the faintest rustle of leaves when he moved. As he neared the coordinates marked on the map, Steve saw what he was looking for, a temple, half covered in moss and vines. It seemed ancient, its blocks worn by time. The stone structure was decorated with strange symbols, twisting, spiraling shapes that almost looked like code. The fragments he had collected so far had all hinted at something bigger, something hidden within the heart. Now, he felt that same energy radiating from the temple. He approached cautiously, eyes scanning the area for traps. The jungle was known for its puzzle-laden ruins, and Steve wasn't about to make a mistake here. But the temple was different. It wasn't a traditional jungle temple with tripwires or pressure plates. Instead, as Steve stepped inside, the door closed behind him with a heavy thud. The ground shifted beneath his feet, and the walls began to hum. "Welcome, traveler," a voice boomed from all around him. Steve froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his sword. The voice didn't come from a mob. It was mechanical, almost like a program running on an ancient server. The voice continued, "You have come to seek the heart, but you must prove worthy, as others before you have failed." Before Steve could react, a redstone door slid open, revealing a dark passageway. Torchlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. As he walked forward, the hum from the walls grew louder. The passage led to a large chamber, its walls lined with ancient stone slabs covered in intricate carvings. At the far end of the room, on a raised platform, sat the 6th fragment, a jagged shard of obsidian. But there was a catch. The floor was covered in lava, flowing from cracks in the stone. The only safe way across was a series of narrow stone platforms suspended in the air, barely wide enough for a footstep. And standing guard at the other end of the room, 2 iron golems stood motionless, as if they were part of the temple's ancient defense system. Steve had encountered iron golems before, but these weren't normal. Their eyes glowed with a faint red light, their bodies shimmering with frozen skulk, and when Steve approached, they creaked to life, their heads swiveling to track his movement. The voice spoke again. "You must pass the trial of balance. Only then may you claim the heart's power." Steve's mind raced. This was no ordinary puzzle. This was a test. He surveyed the room. The platforms were spaced just far enough apart that crossing would be a challenge, especially with the golems on guard. But the lava would burn through his armor if he fell. He pulled out the fragment map. The 6th fragment sat at the end of the platform, just above the lava. but there were no hints in the book about how to get past the guardians. A flicker of movement caught his eye. One of the golems was shifting, its body slowly turning to face him. He needed a plan. First, he took out his bow and aimed it at the nearest golem, shooting an arrow with perfect precision into its chest. The golem staggered, its glow flaring in irritation, but it didn't charge. It wasn't moving. Odd, Steve thought, taking a step closer. Then it hit him. These weren't ordinary golems. They were part of the trial, just like the walls, just like the puzzle. They wouldn't attack until he tried to pass the platforms. He had to balance the puzzle, making sure not to trigger the golems, while also navigating the platforms. Steve placed a wool block on the first platform, stepping carefully onto it. He immediately felt the familiar hum of pressure beneath his feet. The platform tilted slightly, but didn't fall. He moved quickly, placing wool beneath his feet as he went. Each step was calculated: foot down, check for balance, step again. The golems stared, their eyes flashing every time he placed a wool block. Step, step. Steve jumped across the gap and landed on the next platform, placing more wool. He was halfway through the room when the first golem moved. It stomped toward him, its massive body charging. Without thinking, Steve sprinted, leaping over the gap, landing just short of the next platform. He barely caught himself before falling into the lava, but he kept his balance. The golem reached the platform, its hammering footsteps shaking the room. It was close. Another jump, another wool block. He was nearly there. He could see the obsidian fragment just ahead, gleaming with cold, jagged edges. But then, just as he reached the final platform, the golem swiped at him with its iron fist. Steve ducked. He grabbed the fragment. With a sharp intake of breath, he spun around, dodging another swipe and making the final leap back across the platforms. The golem growled in frustration, but it was too late. The fragment was his. He sprinted back down the hallway, the stone door opening before him as the hum of the room died away. The voice spoke one last time. Trial passed. The heart is within your reach. Steve held up the sixth fragment in his hand. 6 fragments now. He could feel the power in his grip. As he left the temple, the jungle seemed to shift. The vines swayed gently, and the distant sound of mobs returned, but there was still an unsettling quiet around him. The world felt like it was being watched. And somewhere, far away, that figure from the ice peaks, the one who had spoken of the code, was waiting. The final pieces of the puzzle were about to fall into place. Chapter 8: Skybound. Steve stood at the edge of the cliffs, staring into the abyss. Below him stretched the floating islands, a massive chain of end stone and purple towers that seemed to hover impossibly in the sky. The islands had long been abandoned by the Ender Dragon, but they still pulsed with residual energy. The fragment map marked the next piece deep within this aerial maze. This place had always been a mystery, a forgotten remnant of a time before the end. It felt like a place out of balance, where the laws of the overworld didn't apply. With a deep breath, Steve adjusted his gear and activated the elytra wings he had prepared. It was the only way to cross such a vast, sky-high expanse. He jumped from the cliff and spread his wings, catching the wind. The cold air hit his face, but he was used to it by now. The sky was his domain now. But the floating islands weren't as peaceful as they seemed. Just ahead, Endermen shimmered into view, floating like specters, their eyes glowing purple as they watched Steve's every move. They weren't hostile at first, but the more he moved through their territory, the more they seemed to react, gathering in greater numbers. He focused on the first island, heading for a large purple tower that stretched high above the others. It was old, its surface cracked and weathered, with vines growing along the edges. As he approached, he noticed something strange. The air around the tower shimmered with distortion, like a broken block texture in mid-transition. It was a rift. Steve's heart skipped a beat. He had learned to recognize these anomalies. Corruption. It had spread beyond the overworld, tearing through the fabric of space. This was where the corruption had started, where it was most concentrated. Without hesitation, Steve banked left and began flying toward the rift. As he got closer, the rift began to pulse, its jagged edges sparking with purple energy. Then, out of nowhere, a shrieking ender crystal shot from the rift, crackling with dark energy. It was as if the world itself was rejecting his presence, the sky twisting in response. He dodged the crystal by a hair's breadth, narrowly missing the explosion of purple energy. The shockwave sent him tumbling through the air, but he regained control and banked sharply toward the center of the island. There, in the middle of the floating ruin, stood a monument, a stone obelisk, unlike any Steve had seen before. The sixth fragment was embedded at the top of the structure, glowing with an eerie purple light, surrounded by corrupted ender pearls that floated in midair like miniature black holes. Steve carefully landed on the nearest ledge, his wings folding behind him. The Endermen, no longer passive, gathered in the distance, their glowing eyes fixed on him. The air grew thick with tension, and the rift pulsed again, this time more violently. Then he heard a voice. "You are too late." The words echoed through the rift, reverberating in Steve's chest. It was the same voice, the one he had heard earlier in the jungle, the one that had spoken from the rift. Steve tightened his grip on his sword. "I'm not done yet," he muttered, focusing on the obelisk and the fragment embedded within it. He reached into his inventory and pulled out his ender pearls. One by one, he threw them toward the floating crystals, breaking their hold over the area. With each blast, the Enderman hissed in fury, charging at Steve, but he held them off with his sword, slicing through the dark figures that blinked in and out of existence. Then, with a final throw, Steve hurled an ender pearl directly at the fragment. It hit the base of the obelisk, causing a massive shockwave to ripple through the floating islands. The ender crystals shattered into dust, and the fragment dislodged from its resting place. As the obelisk crumbled, Steve reached up and grabbed the seventh fragment, but the rift didn't close. Instead, it expanded. The sky above grew dark, and the ground beneath him rumbled. The Enderman stopped moving, now silent, watching. Then, from the heart of the rift, a massive creature began to emerge. It was an ender beast, a towering, corrupted creature made of twisted ender energy. Its body was a swirling vortex of black and purple, its glowing eyes fixed on Steve like an apex predator. It let out a deafening screech as it stepped forward, its feet causing the very air to vibrate. Steve's heart pounded. He had to act quickly. With the rift growing larger by the second, he turned and dove toward the nearby cliff, using his elytra to soar across the gap and land safely on the next island. The enderbeast followed, its large glowing form distorting the air behind it. Steve didn't look back. He sprinted across the island, ducking behind ancient purple ruins as the creature roared in fury. The Endermen were still watching, frozen in place as the rift pulsed. Steve felt the presence of the heart growing closer. He reached the edge of the island and turned back one last time. The enderbeast was gaining, its form flickering with lightning. Steve jumped. With a final burst of energy, he launched himself into the air, his wings catching the wind. The creature howled as it was sucked back into the rift, but it was too late. Steve held the seventh fragment tightly in his hands. He was almost there. Chapter 9: The Broken Stronghold. The sky was heavy with clouds as Steve stepped onto the cracked stone of the stronghold. It had been a long journey to get here, across vast oceans, through deep forests, and over mountains that scraped the heavens. But now, in the heart of the Overworld, Steve faced the final piece of the puzzle, the heart of the Overworld. But it was no longer the same Overworld. The landscape had shifted since Steve's first steps. The world was slowly folding in on itself, the corruption spreading like ink in water. Glitching blocks appeared at random, and mobs appeared and disappeared in stutters, disjointed and broken. The Stronghold was a place of contradictions. Half of it was trapped in stone, untouched by time. The other half had been swallowed by corruption, twisted, darkened, and crumbling. The walls flickered in and out of existence, the very fabric of reality wavering. Steve held the seventh fragment in his hand, a shard of obsidian that seemed to hum with an ancient power. It was the final piece he needed. He could feel it, a deep, familiar pull from somewhere in the depths of the Stronghold. Somewhere beneath the broken floors and the end portal. He moved deeper into the Stronghold, weaving between shattered bookshelves and broken stone. The place felt like a forgotten dream, a maze of memories, all twisted and corrupted by something far older than Steve could imagine. It was then that he heard it. The voice. Welcome home. It was the same voice that had spoken to him through the rifts, the one that had guided him through the corruption, the voice that had promised destruction, a force beyond anything Steve had ever faced. Steve tensed, his grip on the sword tightening. He stepped into a large chamber at the heart of the stronghold, an area surrounded by ancient stone pillars, and at the center, a massive altar stood, its surface cracked and covered with a thin layer of dust. But it wasn't the altar that drew Steve's attention. It was the heart of the overworld, floating above the altar. A massive, glowing fragment that pulsed with the energy of all the pieces combined, surrounded by swirling patterns of corrupted code. The heart was everything: power, life, and the source of the corruption that had been spreading throughout the world. As Steve approached the altar, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the same figure that had appeared in the ice peaks, the one who had spoken to him from the rift, the entity behind the corruption. He was cloaked in obsidian armor, his eyes glowing with the static of fractured code. His voice, once distorted, now sounded clear. "You are too late," he said, his voice cold and final. "The heart is mine. You cannot stop what is already in motion." Steve's mind raced. He had faced challenges, fought mobs, and uncovered secrets. But this was different. This was the source, the heart, the thing that had caused everything to unravel. "Who are you?" Steve demanded, his voice steady, despite the uncertainty creeping into his chest. "Why are you doing this?" The figure's laugh was hollow. "I am the code, the system. The heart is but a part of me, a flaw in the world, waiting to be corrected. You do not understand. You cannot comprehend." Steve stepped forward, holding the fragments in his hand. "I understand enough to know that this corruption must end." The figure's eyes flared with a sickly purple light. "You have no choice. The heart must be reborn. The world must be remade." In that moment, everything around Steve seemed to shift. The stronghold flickered and twitched, blocks coming and going in stutters, like the very code of the overworld was breaking apart. The ground cracked, revealing vast pits of endstone beneath, and the rift that had been following Steve's every step now expanded, threatening to swallow everything. With a flash, the figure was upon him, his sword, a blade made of pure corrupted obsidian, swung down towards Steve, who barely managed to block with his own blade. "You cannot fight the code," the figure sneered, pushing him back. "It is inevitable." Steve gritted his teeth, refusing to give up. The fragments he had collected felt heavy in his pocket, their power calling out to him. The heart above the altar pulsed, its light flickering with more intensity, as if responding to the battle. The corruption in the room twisted and writhed, pushing Steve to the edge. He had no time to waste. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the overworld itself. With a swift move, Steve dodged the figure's next strike and grabbed the seventh fragment, holding it up to the heart. The pieces began to glow, their energy converging with the heart's pulse. The figure froze, his eyes widening. "No," he hissed, a tremor of fear in his voice. "You cannot." But it was too late. The fragments began to merge, their power combining with the heart's energy. The room shook, the walls flickering and cracking as the corruption began to unravel. The static code surrounding the heart collapsed, and the entire stronghold began to glow with a brilliant light. Steve's body crackled with energy as the power of the heart surged through him. The figure screamed in fury, but his form began to dissolve, unraveling like corrupted code. With a final flash, the figure was gone, and the heart of the overworld was whole. Chapter 10: The Heart Reborn. The glow of the heart filled the entire stronghold, its light so bright it was blinding. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze in time. The walls flickered and shuddered, the sky above darkened, and the very air seemed to hum with power. Steve stood at the center of it all, his hand gripping the last fragment, now pulsing with an intense, rhythmic beat. The heart, restored and whole, throbbed in the center of the room, sending waves of energy throughout the stronghold. For a brief second, everything felt right. Then, the world began to tear. The corruption, the dark code that had plagued the overworld for so long, suddenly fought back, like a last-ditch effort to maintain its grip on reality. The walls shook, cracks appearing in the stone, and the once vibrant blue sky flickered, glitching between its normal state and the static purple of the corruption. Steve clenched his teeth. He had come so far, gathered all the fragments, defeated the twisted figure behind the heart's corruption. But now there was one final choice: to restore the world or to let it fall into chaos. A voice echoed in his mind. It was the same voice he had heard before, the voice of the one who had corrupted the heart, the one who had tried to take over the world. You cannot undo what has been done, Steve. The heart is mine. The code is mine. The world is mine. Steve's grip tightened around the fragment. No. He spoke the word firmly, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't just about power. It wasn't about control. It was about the balance of the world, about the freedom of the overworld. He raised the heart high above his head. This world is not yours. It never was. As he spoke those words, the heart pulsed once more, sending out a shockwave of pure light that flooded the stronghold. The light expanded outward, cutting through the corrupted code, unraveling it, and purging the corruption from the very fabric of reality. The figure, the entity behind the corruption, screeched as it dissolved completely, a final cry of defeat echoing into the void. The rift that had plagued the overworld for so long collapsed in on itself, and the glitching ceased. The Enderbeast faded into nothing, and the fractured walls of the stronghold began to rebuild themselves. Steve didn't lower the heart. He couldn't. The power it held was immense, but he knew it had to be used wisely. The land, the sky, and the creatures of the overworld were watching. Everything was on the brink of change. The fragments had done their job. The heart, now whole, was no longer an object of destruction. It was a force of balance. The stronghold trembled once more, but this time, it was not the destructive tremor of corruption. It was a rumble of life, of rebuilding. The land itself seemed to breathe, to wake up from the nightmare it had been living. The heart pulsed again, this time sending a gentle wave of energy outward. As the wave spread, the corruption that had taken root in the world started to recede. Mobs, once twisted and corrupted by the heart's power, returned to their natural forms. Endermen, once filled with rage and malice, now stood tall, their eyes no longer glowing with hostility, but with a quiet curiosity. Steve smiled, but his relief was short-lived. There was still work to be done. He turned, looking out across the stronghold. He had won, yes, but the world wasn't healed yet. The overworld had been broken, scarred, and it would take time to restore it completely. The heart couldn't fix everything at once. It had restored balance, but the world still needed healing. That was where Steve came in. With the heart of the overworld in his hands, Steve could help guide the world back to its original state. He could rebuild the lands, plant forests, clear the corrupted land, and restore life. The heart was powerful, but it needed a protector, someone to keep the balance and guide the world forward. And Steve wasn't alone. Behind him, Nia stepped forward, a grin spreading across her face. She had been with him through it all. The desert temples, the jungle ruins, the deep dark caverns, and the towering sky islands. Now, as the heart settled into the overworld, she was just as ready as Steve to rebuild. "You did it," she said, her voice warm with pride. Steve turned to her, offering the heart to Nia. "We did it," he corrected, a glint of determination in his eyes. They stood there, looking at the world that was slowly mending itself, the corrupted land starting to heal, the mobs returning to their natural patterns. The trees began to grow again, the grass turning lush and green, the oceans calm and clear. The overworld was alive again, but the adventure wasn't over. It never truly was. Steve looked up at the sky. He had saved the world, but he could sense that there was still so much more to explore. The end was still out there. The Nether, with its dark, dangerous secrets, remained a challenge, and who knew what other mysteries the heart had unlocked? There would always be more to uncover, more to build, more to create, and as long as Steve stood guard over the heart, the overworld would be safe. "Ready for the next adventure?" Steve asked, turning to Nia with a grin. Nia raised an eyebrow, her hand resting on her diamond sword. "Always." With that, Steve and Nia stepped forward, side by side, ready for whatever came next. The heart of the overworld had been reborn, and with it, a new chapter of adventure began.